All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So again, this is the webinar for Staying on Track with Rail Projects. Today we have the rail section from the Right-of-Way and Utilities Division here in Central Office. So for the couple of housekeeping items, so at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a red box that I have circled. Please make sure that your mic is muted. It should be the little microphone with the line through it in red. You should have been muted upon entry, but if not, please just double check that you're muted. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box feature. This presentation does kind of build on itself. So if you want to go ahead and send a question, you can. They're going to try to hold the questions till the end, though, and see what hasn't been addressed. You can send the questions directly to me, the WebEx host, or you can send them to the group. We have other people from that section that are on the webinar today that may be able to address your questions in the chat box as well. Another thing I want to point out is over to the far right side of your screen. You can pull up and see who all the participants are. You can also pull up the chat box with a little chat bubble. If you click the three little dots over on the far right side of the screen, that will pull up the polling. We are going to have 5 polling questions today. So if you want to go ahead and pull up the chat box and the polling feature, that would be great. And then I'm going to get the presentation pulled up.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is Matt Reynolds. I'm the Assistant Division Administrator in VDOT Right-of-Way and Utilities Division, and hopefully this finds everybody doing well and staying healthy. And our intent today is to give you all a broad overview of some of our interactions with the railroads on projects where we intersect with them. And we're going to put the whole team together and try to present some information we hope you find useful and will help you in beating your schedules and budgets on working with the rails. Title of this is Keeping Rail Projects on Track and Trying to Meet Your Advertisement Date Without Derailments. Next, please. Basically, VDOT's Railroad Coordination Section is organized. Our Director of Right-of-Way and Utilities Division is Lori Snyder. She has the responsibilities of signing all the agreements with the railroads, whether it's a right of entry, project agreement, or whatever the case may be, and that's a delegated authority through the Commissioner's Office. Once again, I'm Matt Reynolds. I'm the State Utilities, Rail, and Property Manager for VDOT. Our Rail Program Manager is Debbie Hayslip, and our Rail Project Coordinators are Jason Clary, Bonnie Gowans, and Jamie Surface. Next, please. Here's the contact information for the rail section. Of course, Debbie is the program manager. Jason oversees the work in Richmond, Hampton Roads, and Fredericksburg districts. Bonnie oversees Nova, Canton, and Culpeper districts for VDOT, and Jamie oversees Bristol, Salem, and Lynchburg districts. Not to say that sometimes we don't cross the boundaries with each other, trying to help each other out when workloads dictate that, or if there's some other assistance we can provide to each other. We work as a team and work with localities, railroads, and any other DRPT or any other organization to help make successful delivery of rail projects. Next, please. The first poll question, so we get a kind of a feel for where everybody is. Where do you work? Local government, state government, federal government, a consultant, railroad, or other? As Michaela said, that y'all can answer the poll questions in the chat box.
All right, you should be able to see the results now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm good, Michaela, if you want to move on.
Okay.
What does VDOT's rail section do? It's a lot more encompassing what these few words say, but to try to make it brief and give a broad overview, the Right-of-Way and Utilities Division rail section provides statewide coordination with all VDOT construction and maintenance projects that intersect with railroads. This could be road widening, bridge projects, bridge maintenance projects, grade crossing projects, which we work with the ASIP section and traffic engineering and others in the districts. And this all starts at the initial project development at pre-scoping and follows through to project construction to include rail configuration, future needs of the railroads, design, which includes hydraulics and any other means and methods of what we're going to construct, the formal agreements which are necessary to move these towards advertisement and construction. It follows through all the construction activities and any issues that arise during that time, and all the way to the final closeout of the project and final billings from the railroads. Next. Another poll question. What is your role with projects with rail activity if you are involved in these? Are you a project manager? Do you deal with the acquisitions for any, say, rail right-of-way easements? Are you a designer of the project and designing with part of the design team for these projects that intersect with rails? Do you work in the utilities or a utility coordinator? Are you a construction manager or other?
All right, the poll results should be up again.
Okay, whenever you're ready. Okay. All right, VDOT's involvement in locally administered projects. Of course, localities, you may choose to administer your VDOT sanctioned projects that may include rail involvement. Basically, our section is there to offer guidance and share knowledge and experience to assist any locality as they work with the railroad, whether that's with the design features, who to coordinate with, what to expect, the time frames, what kind of budget you should have, and any other issues that may arise. We are there to work with you. We're not really there to do the work for you, but we're there to offer you any assistance we may have to assist you in being successful in delivering the railroad projects or your road projects that intersect with railroads. And we reach out to anyone and everyone. Your consultants contact us a lot. I know that from just this past week that we received numerous questions from consultants or localities, and really our goal is really just to help y'all get through the process, hopefully be successful, and offer anything we can do to make that a successful experience. With that, hopefully the rest of this presentation is going to get not as boring as my words and just sitting here talking. And I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Hayslip, our rail project manager, program manager rather, and let her go through some of her parts of the presentation and provide some more information. Debbie?
Excuse me. Thank you, Matt. Want to go over some things that you need to know when you're working around the railroads and what you should know when you're contacting them. If you or your project is located on, over, or adjacent to a railroad property or operations of the railroad, they should be contacted. We're going to discuss at length in other slides the information that they're going to need and when you need to approach them and what they need from you to keep your project on track. Highway Administration, the blue highlight here allows for you to click that to take you to that website. Excuse me. These requirements need to be met in order for you to go to advertisement with your plan. If you're working within 25 closest rail or using equipment that could foul the railroad tracks, an agreement's required with the railroad, and track protection will also be required. As Matt spoke, there are different types of agreements. You can have a right of entry, you may have a permit, or you may have an agreement, a construction agreement. Know what they own. Railroads have railroad boundary maps, which shows all their property lines across our state. Availability to those boundary maps. The railroads also don't mind sharing them with you if you have a project with them. Next. Just wanted to show you this map so you can understand why there's so much rail involvement with our projects. This shows the major corridors, which are the red. The red is the railroads and the green is our highways. The railroad was here first, and all of our major roads were built around the railroad. So that's why we hit them so much with our projects. And we're hoping with this presentation that you'll understand how to work with them. Next. There are several resources for your guidance, and we just want to bring them to your attention with the next couple of slides. Currently, there is for right-of-way and utility rail manual of instructions. It has not been fully approved. It's in the review process, and we're hoping to have the final approval on that and have that uploaded so that it's easy to access sometime this summer. If you want a copy of that, I certainly don't mind emailing it to you. Also, the local administer projects manual, all the highlights in blue that will allow you to go to those resources by just clicking on these if you pull up this presentation later. Chapter 16.12 talks about rail projects and what needs to happen. The Federal Code, Section 23 CFR 635.307 and 646.200-220, they're all federal codes. Excuse me. They're all federal codes pertaining to railroads and working around them. Of course, you have Norfolk Southern Public Project Manual. Norfolk Southern and CSX are Class 1 railroads. So there's a project manual on their website. Our short lines will refer to either Norfolk Southern's Public Project Manual or CSX. When you contact the short line, they'll tell you which one that they'll be working under. Do not have a public projects manual. And then, of course, there's AREMA, the American Railroad Engineer and Maintenance of Right-of-Way Association. That's another source that gives you a wealth of information when working around railroad. Next. A picture of a manual of instructions. For the first time in 115 years of VDOT, there's a rail manual. To our knowledge, has never been in the state of Virginia. So just know that we have just created it, and we do know that as we go along, there will be some revisions to it. Next. This manual, chapter 10, talks about locally administered projects. We discussed design standards, preliminary activities, project schematics, utility relocations, the agreement process, the authorization to incur costs, and the pre-construction meeting. Next. Chapter 17 of our manual provides a wealth of resources, links, and code sections and guidance that you would need when you're working around rails. The appendices has examples of agreements and correspondence and other documents that are used by VDOT. These are for VDOT only. They would not be for your local administrative projects. However, it would give you an idea of what kind of documentation the railroad's looking for and the process that we follow in order to get to advertisement. Next. Documents for localities, of course, are going to be different. You need to contact your railroads directly to find out what they want you to be using, what format they have for you out there. The two public project manuals websites for CSX and Norfolk Southern have a wealth of information, and they have all the forms that will be required by them for you to move your project forward. The public projects manuals are just a good source for your design. They're a good source for anything that would be related to your project working around rails. Next. Just take a look at this picture. What's wrong with this picture? Obviously, you can see the cars on the wrong side of the gate. And it didn't work out like it was supposed to. But I wanted to show this picture because this is why the railroads are so, safety is their first and number one priority, and it's what they consider in the design of our projects, because it is so easy for something like this to happen around railroad property. Next. Project coordination, I'd like to talk about that for just a few moments. The railroads prefer one sole point of contact from the preliminary phase of your projects to the completion of the project and final closeout. So that one point of contact with us, Matt went over the people that work in the rail section, starts with either being Jamie, myself, Bonnie, or Jason. So when you work with the railroad, you need to establish one point of contact. That person is going to be one that submits everything to the railroad and helps to resolve issues. This person needs to be involved as early as possible. As soon as you know that you're going to have a rail project somewhere, you may not even have plans yet, but this person, this point of contact, needs to be involved, and they need to start reaching out to the railroad and getting the railroad on board with your project. Of course, I stated with the slide that I showed you, safety is the railroad's greatest concern, and that's at all times. That's when you're designing your project, and that's when you're constructing your project. The number one priority is going to be safety. Railroads must approve your plans prior to executing an agreement. Jamie's going to discuss that further. As you're developing your project, you need to be involved. You need to look at every phase of your plan development, and you need to answer their reviews and writing back to them to keep your project going. But Jamie's going to explain all of that to you. Railroads will not normally incur any costs from our projects. Having said that, whenever we have a project around the railroad, any time that they expend on your project, even for reviews or anything, you're going to have to pay for that. There are force accounts that will be created with your project. The first, a force account. This is an estimate that is determined by your project and the railroad on how much time they think they're going to have to spend with you to get the preliminary phase completed. The other is your construction force account. This is the cost to your project that will happen during construction to completely to close out. Both of these will be created and developed, and then there has to be a formal approval of these two before the railroad will begin working. When should the railroad be notified? The railroad, oh, there's a poll question, I'm sorry. When should the railroad be notified? Prior to plans and schematics being developed, an introduction package is sent to the railroad, introducing the project and asking for the future needs at this project location. We're going to discuss this in detail with you further into the presentation. The needs of this location may have some influence on your project development. Getting the railroad involved early will allow you to know what's going to happen at this location. You could have a corridor that's being used for high-speed rail or potentially double stacks. They may need additional tracks in this area, and they may need a service road, which is not uncommon when we are doing projects over them. The preliminary force account for the railroad is based on the complexity of your project. The range for the preliminary force account can be anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000. And again, like I said, that is on the complexity of the project. How many reviews that will go on will determine this preliminary force account. Next. And now we have another poll question. What a railroad DOT number and a milepost represents and how to find it. Well, it's nice to see that some of you do know what the DOT and the milepost number represents, but there's a large majority of you that do not know. So we're going to cover that in the next couple of slides. Next. One of the places that you can obtain this information, also additional information, is the Federal Rail Administration site. There's an inventory site here, and if you were to hit on this blue, it would take you there. That inventory site will state exactly where your project is. It will give you your milepost. It will give you your DOT number. It will give you the division for the railroad that you'll be working in. It gives you counts of railroad activity. It just gives you a wealth of knowledge that would be considered their inventory. The other place that you can get the same information, if you're in an at-grade crossing, there's always signage at your at-grade crossings that will give you this information. Next. This slide here, you can see the CSX plaque. This is on the arm of a signal, the post of the signal. See, there's a 1-800 number on this plaque. There's also a 1-800 number on the sticker for Norfolk Southern. That 1-800 number is an emergency number. You can call that number anytime that you see something's not right. If there's gates that are hung down, if there's a car that's stalled on the tracks, if there's debris or something that could possibly cause a derailment. If you call this number and give them DOT number, which is the 6-digit number, 623-838E, which your DOT numbers are always 6 numbers with a letter to follow, or you give them the milepost. This particular milepost is SA 54.16. This milepost is similar to our mile markers on our highways. For instance, if you're on 95 and you're near the city of Richmond, you're going to be I-95 milepost or mile marker 78 is that exit. So this is the same way as it identifies the railroad. You're on the SA line and you're at mile marker 54.16. On the Norfolk Southern one, you will see that they have their DOT number 714341. That's an S. That helps you to remember that the last thing on there is always going to be a letter, not a number. And this one is Main Street in Clifton, Virginia. Next, the introduction package. In your introduction package, there's several things that you need to supply to the railroad. One of the things that you need to identify is your project number. The railroads are going to open up a project file, and having your project number is a good way to reference when you're sending things into them. You need to provide geographic data to locate your project. You need the city, county, a route or street name, a Google or Bing map, the railroad DOT number, which we just talked about how you can, there's two places you can find that, and the milepost. You need to give them the current vertical and horizontal clearance, the project status and timelines and schedules, when you anticipate that you would like to advertise your project, how long you're anticipating your construction will last. You need to tell them any signals that you know of that are involved and the drainage impacts to their projects. Drainage is a big deal with the railroad, and Jamie's going to talk a little bit about that later as well. Next. Your package needs to have a detailed description of your project scope. Jamie's going to discuss that in the next couple of slides to give examples of what they're looking for. You have to have relevant project documents such as plans, any specifications that you can share with them up front that will help them to understand our projects and the potential impacts to their railroad. Written correspondence authorizing the railroad to incur fees. We talked about the preliminary force account budget. They're not going to work on your project until they have approval to charge to your project. When you're in the preliminary stages and you haven't really started the development, you're just trying to find their future needs. Sometimes you can give them a small amount of $5,000 to work with until you can establish your project and the scope of it, and then you can create the preliminary force account. Jamie's going to discuss the next couple of slides to you. They're samples to kind of give you an idea of what when we say you need to give them the scope of your project. I'm going to turn this over to Jamie Surface.
Hey, good morning. A couple things I want to talk about on these two previous slides, or a couple previous slides. As you're gathering the information on your project, please remember that you may not go on to railroad right away for survey or for any other type of purpose without a right of entry from the railroad. They typically construe that as trespassing if you do, unless you're at a at an established crossing. So just keep that in mind, and we'll go into that a little bit later as well. But so anyway, the example of a project scope. This is a project that we is just recently completed down in the Hampton Roads area. And this is kind of what the railroad's looking for. Please remember that anybody that's reviewing these plans and projects for the railroads are from somewhere else. Norfolk Southern, typically, most of those folks are either in Atlanta or North Carolina. CSX is typically Philadelphia or Washington. So they don't really have the knowledge, the location knowledge that you do. So you need to explain to them like they've never been there before. So basically, this project scope tells us that the project was along Military Highway Route 13 in Northampton Boulevard. It gives the length of the project along Military Highway, 0.02 miles south of Lowry Road, 0.23 miles north of Interstate 64, and again along Hampton Boulevard, Northampton Boulevard as well. The project length, the total project length is 1.58 miles. Next, Michaela. So we've given them the location. Now we want to tell them, in essence, what we're doing here. So this project includes the installation of a continuous flow intersection. The CFI elements will direct the turning vehicles on Military Highway away from the main intersection. So this goes through, and I don't need to read all this. You guys can do that. But this goes through basically what the project scope, what we're proposing to build there. So I think that's the most important thing here. Typically, what the railroad's going to do is they look at this and they need to look at the big picture. This project included a signal, a new crossing and a signal. And so they need to take a look at the big picture when they're designing their signalization and their crossing, so they can meet not only their needs but our needs as well. Typically with signalization, there's going to be some type of preemption there. There's going to be a lot of other things the railroad needs to look at. So they need to get an idea of the big picture. Next. And this is what our project cover sheet looked like for that project we were just talking about. So you can see this was a very complex project. The railroad was just a small piece of this, but they still need to see how this fits into, how their portion of it fits into the big picture. Next. This is another example of a project. This one was a bridge project. This was a little bit simpler than the military highway project, but still it gives the railroad the information that they need. This was a bridge replacement project that's still underway, but this basically tells them why we're doing it, what we're going to do, and how we're going to be constructing this on the railroad, on or over the railroad right-of-way. If there are retention ponds or stormwater management facilities, we need to tell them that, especially if they're close or adjacent to the railroad right-of-way. The trains, as you guys know, are very, very heavy, so they take a look at their zone of influence as far as the bearing of the surrounding area, so they don't run into an issue there. They also need to look at how the drainage is going to work and how we're going to direct drainage. We cannot direct drainage toward the railroad or any additional drainage toward the railroad in these configurations. So you've got to remember that. So this kind of gives them the big picture, and it also gives them some of the unique characteristics of the project. Next. And I think I just gave you the answer to this. Sorry, it's a poll question about directing additional drainage into the railroad property. You should all get this one right. Oh, it's good to see you guys are paying attention. All right, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, the reviews. We've talked a little bit already about how the project gets set up as far as the review goes. The railroad is going to require some type of preliminary engineering force account at the beginning of the project. When they go to look at it, they're going to look at the determining what the future needs are for the railroad. Basically, this is what we're talking about, project reviews. It needs to be submitted to the railroad. They typically take about 30 days, although that's been a little bit more lately. So, somewhere in that neighborhood, 30 to 45 days for that. Any review comments must be addressed in writing back to the railroad. So if they have anything they want to ask, we must do all this in writing. We can that way everybody's covered, everybody understands what's going on. If there's an easement required on the railroad, and which they are requiring easements now for some projects, bridge projects, they're requiring easements. So utility projects, they are not. Matt will cover that a little bit later, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But typically, on a bridge project, they are requiring an easement. For minor projects or no plan projects, we just need to provide the railroad documentation demonstrating, how it's what the scope is and the location in relation to the tracks. It can be as simple as a marked up drawing. So that's something that we can discuss. Again, it really just kind of depends on the complexity of the project. The railroad's public project site, as Debbie mentioned, is a good source to receive samples of right of entries, agreements, and project documents. The railroads, neither railroad really likes Localities to use the agreement that VDOT uses. They require a separate agreement or even a different format agreement than what the state uses. So keep that in mind. It's going to depend. That's going to largely depend on how your project is administered. Please, next, please. This is just a sample of an approved sheet. This is the way it comes back from the railroad. You can see it's signed by the public projects engineer. It's also signed by their review engineer. So this is just an example of a bridge project. That's what it'll look like when you get your approved plan sheet back. Next, please. Okay, as we've mentioned several times, the project cost incurred by the railroad is charged to your project from the preliminary phase through the completion of construction. The two force account estimates we've discussed, one is preliminary engineering and one for the construction phase. The approval of those estimates and written notice to proceed is required prior to work beginning. Either way, if you're looking for a preliminary review, you have to give them approval of their force account estimate for preliminary engineering prior to the contractor starting work. They have to have written approval of their construction force account estimate too. Typically with force account estimates, for localities, that has to be deposited with the Class 1 railroads. It's at the discretion of the short line. Some of the short lines you don't have to, but typically the full estimated amount has to be deposited with the Class 1 railroads for locally administered projects. Next, please. Typically, the development of plans follow the 30, 60, 90, 100%, same as the VDOT plans do. What we try to do is we encourage the designers to familiarize themselves with the railroad company's design standards as well as our exceptions. Again, Debbie has mentioned all those publications that have the design standards in them. The public projects manual, the short lines typically don't have a public projects manual, but they do follow the guidelines. Typically, they have a review engineer that does the review on their projects, so they're a good resource as well. Next, please. And here's the kind of a reiteration of those design standards and codes. A couple of things here that weren't mentioned earlier that I think bear mentioning is the the pipe and wire permit for CSX and NS. That's a separate. That's typically a separate permit from anything else that you do in an agreement or right of entry or anything else you do. If you have a water, sewer, or gas line that crosses either railroad or really any railroad, you've got to have a separate pipe and wire permit, and that's typically a separate permitting process. And so that's something to keep in mind if you've got that on your project. The other one that we didn't mention here, and this really comes in handy with sidewalk projects and other types of urban projects as well, is the Railroad Highway Grade Crossing Handbook. That's an FHWA publication, and that will give you the standards, the FHWA standards, as well as that will dovetail with the railroad standards as well. So that'll give you some idea of how they can be configured, what's necessary there, and really the geometric design of those crossings. So that can come in really handy as well. And that link's there. I don't think I really need to say anything else on that one. Next, please. This is an example of somebody who's doing some surveying adjacent to the railroad. Again, you cannot go out on the railroad without a right of entry. That's going to be required. We can assist you with that if you need be, but again, anywhere you are not on a dedicated public crossing, you've got to have a right of entry to be able to access the railroad right of way. That includes clearances, that includes any type of investigation that you may need to do for preliminary engineering. Next, please.
This is Matt. I'll jump in and discuss some of the utilities on railroad right-of-way. I've been dealing with this for, I guess, really way too long. But anyway, this can be as much of a challenge as the rest of your project on accommodating utilities that either have to remain in place or be accommodated for a relocation on your projects. And just to give some brief bullets, overhead utilities are preferred to be underground when crossing the railroads. If not, the vertical clearance is 23 to 25 foot per railroad regulations. The horizontal clearance, poles and valve boxes, handholds, whatever the case may be, should remain off the operating right-of-way of the railroad. Railroads do not grant easements across their property. They only issue permits, which are revocable, same as VDOT and same as a lot of the localities. Private utility companies obtain their own permits in coordinate installation with the railroad with VDOT coordination. The only exception is if VDOT includes the utility relocation as an in-plan item in the VDOT contract. And basically, this is the same as environmental permits. Basically, who controls the work is the one that has to obtain their permits so that the railroad or whatever regulatory authority is dealing with the correct entity if there are issues. In-plan utilities such as the water, sewer line, sometimes gas, they are obtained by the regional utility section with cooperation of the rail section and central office utilities. Utilities on bridges must be encased within the bridge structure, not hanging below for clearance reasons. And when I say encased, this has been a point of contention on several projects over the years, and this is just all railroads require this now. Even if you're using ductile iron water pipe, they're still going to want that water main encased on the bridge. And we've had some discussions, and I guess discussion is a polite word. It goes back probably a decade ago to some projects we were administered in a locality about an hour west of Richmond. And basically the project was in the middle of construction, and it came close to being shut down until Norfolk Southern relented and gave us an exception in that case, but made it clear that we would never be able to relocate a pressurized pipe or any other utility without encasing it on the bridge structure if it's crossing them. And same if you're going underneath the railroad, of course, you have to jack the pipe, and they're not going to let you open cut the railroad, which we have received several inquiries about open cutting rail. I don't think people are really thinking when they're making that decision to try to proceed in that manner. Same as a lot with roadways. We don't like the rails are more stringent than even VDOT on cutting a roadway. That's just not going to happen. Utilities are required to run perpendicular, not on an angle or a skew, which is pretty common for any crossing of whether it's a roadway or a rail. And utilities should be relocated prior to road construction unless they're included within the contract or require some coordination with the rail and contractor to either protect the utility or to relocate it. And this is not all encompassing. As I said, they're very into pipe and wire agreements and permits. Each CSX and NS have these requirements in their public projects manual. Norfolk Southern is referred to as NSCE 8. permit. So just be aware and put a lot of effort on working with these up front as well, because as I said, these can hold up your project as much as getting your plans approved to proceed with construction. Next. I think this is yours, Debbie.
The acquisition package. Jamie talked earlier in another slide about the railroads are requiring acquisitions now of rights. We will go over them. Acquisition package needs to begin at the scoping stage as early as you can with the railroad. The railroad, you will contact their real estate department to work with you and with the acquisition. With your acquisitions, this is something that's kind of come about new. Previously, aerial easements were gotten with the agreement, but they were never recorded. CSX is kind of the lead in this right now. Anytime we have a project over the railroad, even though if it's an existing bridge, they're asking that we acquire the aerial easement and structural easements with the document. You're going to need a plat or a map or some form of a plan sheet showing your easements to include temporary construction easements. You need a meets and bounds description that's typically preferred by the railroads. A recordable legal description is acceptable if you don't have the meets and bounds by some of the railroads, but their real estate section will give you guidance on that. A formal offer of compensation, a bona fide offer, some of you will know, good faith offer or fair market value offer is required with the railroad. You must comply with the FHWA guidelines for acquisitions, which is Title 49 CFR 24. Of course, the Uniform Relocation Acquisition Regulations will apply. The right-of-way and utility manual is on an outside site that you can access now. And that has information in there about the special negotiation section. In central office, Daniel Boggs and Paul Coleman are the two that does our railroad acquisitions. They are there to offer advice to you, just we are with your projects on your acquisitions. Next. This is a plan sheet that is for Denbyville and Hampton Roads. This is one that Paul has recently been working on. As you can see, it's going to show the aerial easement and the temporary construction easement. This is meeting the needs of CSX, what they need this acquisition. Along with this plan sheet, this plat is a legal description on the next page of the proposed aerial easement and the temporary construction easements. And as you can see, this is also sealed. This will be part of the acquisition package. Over next, the next screen to Jamie. He's going to talk about advertisement created so that you have everything in it that you need.
Cool. Okay, the advertisement package. Once you've gone through all the preliminary and you've got approvals, you move into either the agreement phase or right of entry phase. Typically, I'm going to talk more about agreements here because that's typically what we're looking at. Before you can advertise, the agreements are required. Before advertisement, you must have that prior to the right-of-way certification. If you guys have ever done a revenue sharing project or any other type of VDOT funded project, you understand you've got to have right-of-way certification before advertisement. So just keep that in mind that the agreement's got to be complete there. The review of the agreement typically begins around the 90% design of the plans. The agreements typically are not executed until the plans are approved and sealed. If the plans change, sorry if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. If the plans change that impact the railroad, the review process may start over again, and end up delaying your project. So just keep that in mind as well. Full execution of the agreement requires legal reviews and the signatures of the railroad, the locality, and/or the director of right-of-way and utilities when necessary. Now, those agreements can take a couple of different forms. We can talk about that offline if need be. That's really project specific there. The agreement also requires the review and approval of the construction railroad force account estimate. So we're moving from preliminary engineering over into construction. The agreement is really kind of the advertisement is where that switch gets flipped. So next, please, Kayla. Oh, it's another poll question. Yes, it's all the above. Thank you, Michaela. We can move on. Okay, as we start moving toward the advertisement phase, there's a couple things that we need. We need the fully executed construction agreement. I mentioned the right of entry, and again, we can for a project that has little rail impact, we may just have some work adjacent to the right of way. They will ask for a right of entry instead of an agreement. So typically, again, we're talking primarily about agreements here. So it's got to have fully executed construction agreement prior to advertisement. The right of entry application needs to be filled out by the contractor prior to the beginning of work. So part of that advertisement package, there's an actual contractor's right of entry. That goes into the advertisement package blank. The contractor that's awarded the project fills that out. Also, with the advertisement package, there's the railroad work requirements that typically comes in as part of the agreement package as well. There's a railroad special provision that includes insurance requirements. So anytime you're working on railroad right away, you've got to have rail liability insurance. So that's got to be part of the package as well. Typically, that provision is in there. That's also the contractor has to meet those requirements as well. So those two things the contractor has to meet once the project is awarded, but it's got to go into the advertisement package so he knows what he's bidding on. The next thing that goes in there is the construction force account estimate breakdown. What that does is that gives the construction team an idea of how much time is expected to be spent on railroad right of way, whether when they need a flagger or when they need a watch person to be overseeing the work. Also gives the breakdown as far as the railroad inspections go. As Debbie mentioned a minute ago, CSX is now requiring a fully executed deed of easement for bridges over the railroad. So that's got to be fully executed prior to advertisement as well. At this point, the other railroads do not need to do that. Next, please. Okay, once you get your project advertised and it's awarded, this is just a sample of an old 1850 bid tab review sheet. This happened to be for the Blue Ridge Tunnel that just opened up, but as it rails to trails. But you know, you're gonna go through with the project award. You're gonna go through and you're gonna determine the low bidder on that. So we can move on forward from there. Okay, once the project is awarded, you're going to have a railroad pre-construction meeting. Typically, traditionally, this has been held somewhere near the project, so it can be the project elements can be discussed. We've been doing these virtually for the last year or so. But that's really where the contractor, the project sponsor and the railroad get together. They discuss what the aspects are. They discuss the timing and scheduling of the project, and they determine, exactly when the project's going to start, exactly when it's going to end, and they go through the critical aspects of it. If it's work that's going to be required that you have to cross the railroad, they're going to determine exactly how that happens. They're going to really discuss the means and methods of the contractor has for the project. Next, please. So this kind of gives you an idea. These are the things that have to happen either before or directly after the pre-construction meeting. The project sponsor has to give written notice to the railroad to proceed with the force account, the construction force account. We've got to have a fully executed contractor right of entry. I mentioned that goes into the advertisement blank. If there's a pipe or wire crossing, that fully executed pipe and wire agreement has to be taken care of prior to the pre-construction. There's approval of the contractor's insurance. I said he had to have proof of rail liability insurance. That's got to be approved by the railroad. The flagging or construction monitor request needs to go in, and that's where we schedule the flaggers. Then we also talk about submittals for anything from demolition to whatever the case may be that the railroad needs to review and approve prior to construction. Utilities are discussed. Typically, as Matt mentioned, utilities are completely done by the time we get to this point. But if there's any other utility coordination that needs to go on, this is when we talk about it. We discuss the inspection. The railroad companies have several different people that are on site during construction. They have the flagger that's there, that's required to be there anytime you're impacting operating right of way. If you're going to do any work, typically within 15 feet of the active rail, you've got to have a flagger there. If you're doing any work over the rail, you've got to have a flagger there. If you're doing work outside of that, and that 15 feet is kind of a general. It's some railroads require more, none less, but some will allow more. If you're going to be outside of that area, then you can do the work with a watchman, which is a little cheaper than a flagger. So that's one reason we do it. But then the railroad also has an inspector that will come by and visit the project, typically once a week or so. I know Norfolk Southern does it once a week, CSX, thereabouts. So you have those three different types of railroad representatives that can be on site at any given time. Then also the completion date is discussed as well. So when the project is turned back over. Next, please, Michaela. Once the project is complete, then yeah, you're going to do it, Debbie.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Thank you. Your project closeout, we'll discuss that. One thing that I wanted just to bring to your attention from the previous slide that Jamie talked about is, your flagging and your monitoring of your project. Your contractor should have a good safety program in place when they start this project. They should realize that getting in and out quickly is the best way to work on the railroad. It will mitigate any unnecessary work, and having a flagger or your inspector sitting out there while work is maybe going on Pier 3, and Pier 3 is not on the railroad, but you have your flagging protection out there. So if you work efficiently on your railroad, you'll stay within the guidelines of your force account. It's something that is really important. When you get to the project closeout, upon completion of the project construction, the railroad will inspect the right-of-way. If they find the conditions favorable, then they will close the project. If they do not, they will tell you what needs to be corrected. Once the right-of-way is accepted by the railroad, the letter is submitted back to the project manager, stating the same and stating that they will work to close out the project. The railroad charges can take up to a year to hit your project. So having known that, you're not going to be able to close out your project or your funding quickly. If there's money left in the force account that you will reimburse you once they have their final invoice. If it's something that's being charged to you, you'll have an invoice that will state this is your final invoice, and at that time, you know that you can close your project out. Want to let you know there has been some times with our projects that we get a final invoice, and maybe a little bit later will come just because they got hit with charges, but they hadn't anticipated yet. So sometimes that does happen. We recommend that you leave funding available for the railroad up to a year after your project is completed and the railroad has accepted the right of way. The next couple of screens are going to be kind of wrapping up the presentation, and Matt Reynolds is going to cover those.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I'm going to go over a few points to ponder as you get into your coordination with railroads. That picture was my personal resident expert who gives me advice, and the answer is usually no matter what I ask him. But anyway, points to ponder. Projects will not be considered clear for advertisement until a fully executed agreement is in place by all parties. That means whoever, if there's 3 signatories, they all need to be signed. And we will not certify the project to go to advertisement through the certification section in VDOT for a right-of-way and utility certification until that's in place. Right of entries must be in hand prior to entering railroad right-of-way and allow the time to receive the right of entry, and it can take up to 6 weeks depending on the backlog of work the railroads have. One thing I would like to mention here, if you're going out inspecting bridges and you don't have a right of entry and you're on railroad property, we have been asked, how did VDOT or some other entity get these pictures of the bridge that are taken from railroad right-of-way without having a fully executed right of entry? That causes a lot of friction, so be very aware, as Jamie and Debbie, I think, have both mentioned, do not go on right-of-way of the railroad without a right of entry. You are trespassing. And it does nothing to help coordination efforts for a project or anything down the road if that happens over and over time again. Do not accelerate ad schedules without consulting the railroad. Railroads will not compress handling a project to accommodate a sooner ad date as they're working on multiple projects across the state and other states. Air Public's project engineer, we work with both Norfolk Southern and with CSX. They handle several states, 5 or 7 states apiece. Each state has its own demand. So don't expect, while it may be an important project to a district, a locality, or to VDOT, that doesn't mean that the railroad is going to provide more staff or more other people handling the project to help accommodate an earlier ad date than what we presented to them. The resources are limited, and we need to make best use of those. Vertical and horizontal alignments, clearances are set by the railroad, and they will not be compromised by a project. If they are, they will shut the project down if we don't do what we say, or we're not fully engaging that contractor to follow the specifications and the terms of the agreement and the provisions of the contract. Involve the railroad at the scoping stage or earlier. As soon as you know, as has been mentioned before, that there's going to be railroad involvement, go on and introduce the project to the railroad, make them aware of it. That way, speaking to resources, they can kind of schedule the resources and provide those to help accommodate meeting your schedule and move the project forward. Next, please. Don't design a project that calls for the introduction of a new cross unless you're prepared to close 3 existing public crossings. And that's talking about at-grade crossings. This is a common theme. When we do propose a new crossing, we better be ready to have 3 public crossings that we can close. At times, they will settle for 2 if it's something that is acceptable to the railroad. But that can take a lot of time. It goes through several different divisions within each railroad, and actually goes in front of a committee where they have to vote whether they're going to approve that new crossing or not, and looking at the impacts from closing the existing crossings and what traffic is going to be introduced on the new crossing. So be aware of that when, as a locality, you're proposing to introduce a new crossing across a railroad. Drainage should never be directed or increased toward railroad tracks. That doesn't mean a little. That means zero. That doesn't mean 0.08 increase in drainage. It means zero. We have had projects held up to solve this issue because they will not sign an agreement like this. And beware during construction, do not let a revision change that without having input from the railroad or making them aware. So let them review any drainage changes and make sure you get that approved up front as part of the agreement process. Railroad concerns and impacts from the project shall be resolved before an agreement can be executed. That's pretty common sense. Plan changes and for revisions that I was speaking to can potentially start the review process over. So try to limit any plan changes or revisions that do impact the railroad, whether it's over, next to, or across. Equipment and machinery used during construction that could foul or impact railroad right-of-way. You can't store it beside the railroad right-of-way if it can tip onto the right-of-way, such as a crane or any materials that may fall or otherwise foul the tracks or the right-of-way for their access. Proposed construction access to the site that impacts rail right-of-way has to be approved by the railroad. And this is generally a contractor's responsibility through their means and methods and should be handled by them, because while we can provide something that we know they can use, a lot of contractors would come back and propose a different way to access the project or to move different equipment in a different manner than what we proposed or provided them or we see as reasonable. Impacts to railroad warning devices. If your project's impacting those, beware of the cost and the coordination with that. Is those are different sections of the railroads too than we deal with on the public projects engineering side. Next, please. As with all of us, and specifically railroads, safety is a core value and of the utmost importance. When you're on railroad right away, or even when you're on projects, really all of these, it's requirements of the railroads are to have a hard hat with the high visibility, reflective strips, and I think they'll probably be going to the new VDOT requirement for the hard hats there. Safety glasses with side shields are required. DOT class 2 or better safety vest, basically high visibility yellow. So if you're already meeting VDOT requirements with that, your contractors and your staff should be okay. And proper footwear, work boots with steel toes are required. They will not let you on railroad right away, nor should you be without work boots with a steel toe. Next. Hey, Debbie.
Well, that wraps up our presentation. Just remember when you're working on the railroads that you need to allow time for problems to be resolved. You need well-designed plans. You need a lot of teamwork. You need to consider the safety and the corporation of the railroad. You need to be patient. Communication is a huge key. Informing them of any changes that happen as soon as they occur. But all these things and work well together, and just remember that we are all on the same team. We're here to get the projects through with the railroads. We need to work to keep things safe and be successful. We'll take questions now. McKay, do we want to do the questions? I've been trying to answer a few questions in the box already.
Yeah, so I sent you and Jamie the questions that came in. If there are any additional questions, you are able to unmute yourself if you want to do that, or you can send it to the chat box. I don't see anything coming. Oh, hold on. One just came in. Will we receive this presentation? Yes, so today's presentation has been recorded. It takes us about a week to get everything finalized and posted to our website. Once it is posted on our external website, I will send an email out to everyone that was registered to attend today. So if you want to go back and you want to watch it later, or if you want to forward it out to some of your other staff at your locality or your firm, you can do that as well. There at the beginning of the presentation was the contact information for all of the rail. So you can always direct questions to them as well. Is a new bridge over an existing railroad line considered a crossing?
Yes, it is. That's considered a grade separation, and it has to follow all the things we've talked about in this.
Debbie, Tom Fitzpatrick from the Culpeper District. I have a question about right of entry. So in many rural areas, we'll have an existing road crossing that may be guarded or unguarded that goes across the railroad. In some cases, those existing grades or slopes for the road approach are not necessarily acceptable. So if a locality were to take on a project of that nature and they were developing an application packet, it seemed like in the briefing it was very strict about right of entry rules. But the fact we have a road crossing that part of the railroad, is it inappropriate for the locality or a VDOT representative to be taking pictures of the road aspect of that crossing? Or would that technically require a right of entry, like even if you were, let's just say, on the tracks or taking a photo of the signaling or gate?
If you are outside the railroad's right of way, their property lines, and you're taking pictures, you're not, you know, you can do that. But if you're on their right of way, you need to know what their right of way is, and that's what a file map will give you. The right of way around railroads tend to be anywhere from 50 feet across to 100 feet across. So if you're going to be out there encroaching on their right of way, as Jamie stated earlier, you're trespassing. Even if you're not up against the rail, you're on their property, you would be considered trespassing. You would need a right of entry to do that. If you're outside of their right of way, outside of their property lines, and you're taking pictures, you're not impacting them in any way, then you may not need the right of entry. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, generally, but let's just say rule of thumb, if it is a 50-foot right of way for the railroad, is our portion of road the railroad right of way? Because I thought we said you couldn't have something in the railroad's right of way, but we have a road crossing it. So is that considered really their portion of the right of way?
And just to clarify for you, they allow us to cross over them. They allow us to cross over, our highways cross over their right of way. And also we do bridge separations, you know, bridges, they're up, you know, but having said that, even if your road, which this happened with a locality not too long ago, their road, actually the railroad crossing was over, they owned their road. However, there are code sections that says the railroad's operating right away. They have first rights over us, prior rights over us. So even if you own your road and it goes across the railroad, you cannot be operating right away zone. With that project, we had to go through the railroad. We got their bow map, and then it showed our road crossing there, and that little piece of the rails was actually on our roadbed. However, we had to follow the same rules and guidelines as if it was not, because that is their operating right away. Right there, it does not give us approval to get on their right of way except to cross over it with that road.
That's great. Thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate your patience in answering it.
All right, we have another question. Does VDOT have historical cost available for railroad coordination, oversight, etc., for different types of projects, grade separated, at grade, utility crossings, that localities can use for project budgeting?
Well, we create our costs from our history of payments to the railroad, because that does change. We do know pretty much that we can give ballpark figures. You can contact us and say you have a project and it's going to be a bridge, and this is how long it's going to take us and all that. We can go back and look at a like project that has been current, maybe in the last 2 years, and give you an estimate cost. Also, we, if you look at your force accounts, it will give you like flagging days. There's administrative fees. There's engineering fees. We can kind of, dependent upon, we can kind of give you some guidance on that, what you can expect your cost to be. right now with the typical adding a crossing, a new crossing, at-grade crossing to a project, you're looking anywhere from 800 to $1 million because you're going to have signalization and then the crossing that will be put in by the railroad as well. If you're doing a bridge, depending upon the impacts of the bridge, how long you're going to be working over the bridge, you could be up to $1 million for your force account.
Debbie, if a locality wants to get some of that information from you, would they contact y'all's section directly, or would they reach out first to their project coordinators and the project coordinator get that information for them?
However it's set up with them, we the slide they gave us, like wherever you're located, you've got Jamie, Bonnie, Jason, of course, I'm always a good contact. Anytime you have a question or something, you can shoot us an email and we'll do what we can to help you with your project, send you back in any information that we can share with you. We certainly don't mind doing that. Trying to figure out your cost prior to starting your project, it can be a tough deal. And we usually try to we look at a live project, look at what's going to occur, and then we base it on that, and sometimes we'll add a percentage to that to make sure that we budgeted enough money. We don't help with that.
I'd also like to add, going back to the resources of the railroad, they are very limited, and flagging is a big issue and a big cost. And whether it's VDOT, a locality, or a private entity, when you get a flagger on site, make sure they're being used and the contractors are diligently doing prosecuting work while they are there. We've had several instances on some projects where the construction staff, just the flaggers out there for 2 weeks and didn't have to flag. There was no activity on the railroad. So that was a complete waste of funds and a resource. And same with plan changes. Be sure if you're proposing a plan change, don't let it stop your project or go through the whole review process again. Anything that significant should be addressed prior to going to add. And things do happen during construction, and railroads will work with us. They understand that because it happens to them on their projects too. But just be very, very aware, when we estimate a project, there are things beyond our control and beyond your control that may impact that. It could greatly increase that cost. And at times, if you really have a good contractor who utilizes the resources diligently, it could decrease the cost as well. We've seen that also. So, and as Debbie said, we're more than willing to help if you're having a hard time trying to provide an estimate on a rail involved project. We will assist with what we see from our historical data and our recent experiences. So we're always receptive to helping you be successful.
Okay, let me jump in there. This is Lloyd Arnold from the local administered division with Michaela, the local administered projects manager. So regarding the communication, direct communication from the locals to the rail, we want to make sure also that we include the project coordinator. We want that project coordinator to be your single point of contact. And if it turns out you guys are starting to work together with rail, that's fine. But they must be informed at all times of the communication. So I just wanted to make that clarifying point that we don't leave the project coordinator out of the communications.
All right, thank you, Lloyd. All right, we had another question that came into flagger availability has always been an issue with the railroad. Have you seen any changes from the railroad in terms of their requirements for flaggers or their ability to provide flagging protection?
Yes, specifically with CSX, it's getting worse. Even when we schedule years in advance, we still don't have a flagger on some projects the way we expected to or were told we'd be able to. And it's all working with coordinate with them on their work. They for some reason don't want to have excess flaggers. Just to be very candid about it, we have I guess almost monthly conversations just as a generality with CSX and as needed with Norfolk Southern. Norfolk Southern flagging, we're somewhat more successful in having those resources, but once again, CSX is the other class one. And we've even offered where VDOT would pay to have a full-time or 2 full-time flaggers we could use across the state, pay a full salary for annually, and that was turned down. So, I don't really understand that. There's something, I don't know if it's a union issue or what that is, but the changes that we've seen from the requirements really have not changed. They will work with us if it's minimal involvement and use an observer in place of a flagger if it's a contractor who has the right credentials and experience. And Debbie, I'll let you jump in and add anything as well.
Well, just so you all know that Matt and I are constantly every week working on our flagging problems, especially with CSX. Matt has proposed a couple of things to the railroads, and they were kind of shot down, like maybe assign a flagger for a couple of flaggers to the state of Virginia, and somehow we pay their salaries and so forth. So we constantly look for a way to resolve the flagging issues. We've been working with CSX and trying to do a couple of things, such as in Hampton Roads, we had 2 jobs that were going on at the same time, and they were on the same rail line. So we were able to put a flagger at one location and an inspector at the other location, and the flagger would let the inspector know when to clear the tracks. So we try to do some things like that. It is a problem. We don't have it resolved, and we will continue to try to resolve it.
I do not see any more questions at this time. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar today. I want to thank Matt, Debbie, and Jamie for being here today. Really appreciate your time and helping us get out this information to the localities. Again, today's webinar was recorded. It takes us generally about a week to get everything posted. Once we have it all posted on our external website, if you were registered for the webinar today, you will receive an email notifying you that it has been posted on the external website. And again, you can forward this the link out to anyone, any of your coworkers that you think would benefit from hearing this information. And with that, we will wrap up for today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.